Happy 32nd Aneurin, Belvine purred, sliding a silver envelope across the mahogany. A gift for your future. I opened it, my blood turning to ice. An eviction notice? Today? Xylia's laughter erupted, her phone lens glowing like a predator's. Surprise! We're finally clearing out the dead weight. You've overstayed your welcome, Belvine added, her voice a cold, polished blade. It's time this house belongs to those who truly matter. I looked down at the silver paper, then out at the horizon, where the light began to shift into a sharp, unforgiving glow. The golden hour in Charleston usually feels like a warm embrace. But today, the light hitting the white pillars of our colonial revival porch felt as cold as surgical steel. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my hands resting on the surface I had spent 3 weeks refinishing 2 summers ago. I could still smell the faint, lingering scent of beeswax and sawdust, the ghosts of my own labor. For 5 years, I poured every spare cent and every ounce of my soul into restoring this house, believing that by saving these walls, I was saving my place within this family. I looked at the faces around me, illuminated by the flickering glow of 32 candles on a cake I had bought for myself. My siblings, Xylia and Cyprian, were laughing at a joke I hadn't heard. Their laughter sounded like broken glass hitting a marble floor. Sharp, empty, and dangerous. I've always believed that a house is built of bricks and beams, but a home is constructed entirely of truth. Sitting there, I felt the foundation beneath us beginning to hairline fracture. My mother, Belvine, presided over the table with a regal, icy composure that always made me feel like an uninvited guest in my own life. She spoke at length about the Rickman legacy and the importance of maintaining our family's standing in the historic district. She praised the beauty of the crown molding and the steadiness of the floorboards, all while looking right through me, completely ignoring the fact that it was my calloused hands that had kept this legacy from crumbling into the South Carolina humid air. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood, only to realize you are the only one who truly sees the shadows in the corners? It's a lonely kind of clarity. Aneurin, dear, you look tired, Belvine said, her voice a polished blade wrapped in silk. Perhaps the weight of this house is becoming too much for a young woman alone. I didn't answer. I simply adjusted my grip on my napkin, my knuckles whitening. I wasn't just tired, I was being erased in real time. Then came the gift. Belvine reached beneath the table and produced a formal, silver-wrapped envelope. It was heavy, topped with a blood-red bow that looked like a fresh wound against the metallic paper. She slid it across the mahogany, the friction making a soft, shushing sound that seemed to silence the entire porch. A gift for your future, Aneurin, she said, her eyes fixed on mine. For your independence. I untied the bow. It fell to the table like a discarded ribbon of silk. Inside was a single document. My eyes scanned the bold black lettering at the top. Notice to quit. Tenant at sufferance. My heart didn't race. It slowed down. A heavy thud in my chest that felt like a closing door. It was an eviction notice. 70-hour hours to vacate. The mother who had watched me sweat over these floors was now telling me I had overstayed my welcome. She claimed my presence was hindering the family's financial restructuring. You can't be serious, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Immediately, Xylia's phone was in the air. I saw the familiar interface of her live stream, the red live button glowing like a predator's eye. Look at this, guys, Xylia chirped to her thousands of followers. The little sister is finally getting a reality check. Someone's gotta grow up and stop playing house on mom's dime, right? Cyprian leaned back, a cruel smirk twisting his handsome face. I've already talked to the contractors, Aneurin. Your little workshop in the back? It's perfect for the home gym I've been wanting. Don't worry, we'll help you pack the junk you've been hoarding. The betrayal was suffocating, a thick Charleston fog that threatened to pull the air from my lungs. But as I looked at them, my mother's cold expectation, Xylia's digital voyeurism, Cyprian's naked greed, a strange, crystalline calm settled over me. I remembered something my father used to say, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't give Xylia the viral breakdown she was so desperately filming for. I simply placed the notice back on the table, next to my birthday cake. "Thank you, Mother," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Thank you for finally being honest. It's the most valuable gift I've received in years." Confusion flickered in Belvine's eyes. This wasn't the reaction she wanted. She wanted a plea. She wanted me to beg for a few more weeks. She didn't realize that by serving this notice on my birthday, she had committed a tactical error rooted in her own arrogance. Under South Carolina law, an eviction notice served under these specific pretenses was a double-edged sword, especially when the tenant held a secret they weren't ready to share. "Don't be dramatic, Aneurin," Belvine snapped. "It's just business. We all have to make sacrifices for the family." "Kindness isn't a sign of weakness, Mother," I replied, standing up slowly. "It's the only thing that keeps us human when the world turns cold. I'm sorry you've forgotten that." I picked up a knife and cut a large piece of cake, sliding it onto a plate and offering it to Xylia. She lowered her phone, looking irritated by my lack of distress. "Have some cake, Xylia. You'll need the energy for all that restructuring you're planning." I turned and walked away from the table, my shadow stretching long across the porch. I made my way to my room, the room they were already measuring for gym equipment. I closed the door and ran my hand along the doorframe. I felt the grain of the wood, the imperfections I had carefully sanded and sealed. They thought they were taking a house. They didn't understand that they were merely losing a daughter. I wasn't a victim. I was the architect of the coming storm. I knelt by the corner of the room and pried up a loose floorboard beneath my bed. Tucked away in the dark was a leather-bound folder, thick with original deeds, and a handwritten codicil signed by my father just weeks before he passed. My fingers traced his signature. He had known this day would come. He had seen the greed in my mother's eyes long before I was old enough to name it. "I'm not leaving, Dad," I whispered into the silence of the room. "I'm just clearing the house of the people who don't belong here." My phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from Soren, the only man who still remembered my father's true intentions. "The paperwork is ready," the text read. "Are you sure you want to go through with the sale?" I looked at the eviction notice lying on my nightstand, the red bow still mocking me. I didn't hesitate. I typed back a single word. "Yes." The vibrations started deep in my bones before the sound even reached my ears. It was a rhythmic, mechanical scream that ripped through the silence of 6 a.m., shaking the very floorboards I had lovingly polished by hand. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scent of sawdust, usually a comfort to me, was thick and acrid in the air. I didn't need to check the clock to know the 72-hour countdown had begun with a declaration of war. I threw open my bedroom door and stopped dead. 2 men in work boots were already in the foyer, their movements efficient and heartless. Cyprian stood over them, arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. The built-in oak bookshelves, the ones our father had helped me sand down until our fingers were raw, were being pried from the walls. Crowbars bit into the historic wood with a sickening crunch. My restoration workstation, the heart of my professional life, was already a pile of splintered timber near the front door. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay stoic. "This is historic wood. You're destroying the foundation of this room." Cyprian didn't even flinch. He stepped forward, his shadow looming large in the early light. When I tried to move past him to stop the laborers, he shoved me back. It wasn't a violent blow, but it was heavy with the weight of his perceived authority. I stumbled against the doorframe, the cold bite of the wood pressing into my shoulder. "Easy there, Aneurin," he sneered, his eyes narrow and mocking. "Mom decided she needs more open space for the foyer, a grand entrance for grander people. Since you're just a tenant at sufferance, you don't get a vote on the floor plan. The master of the house dictates the design, and you're just the help that stayed too long." I stood there, surrounded by the dust of my father's legacy, and forced myself to breathe. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a breakdown. Anger is a wind that blows out the lamp of the mind, and I needed my mind sharp. I looked at the ruin of my workstation and then directly into Cyprian's hollow eyes. "You can destroy the wood, Cyprian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady hum. But you can't build a conscience out of the ruins. You think you're clearing space, but you're only showing me how empty you really are." He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed in the gutted room. I turned my back on him and began to gather my essential tools. I protected my hands, the hands that heal things, while they watched with triumphant smirks. My room was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. By noon, the house felt like a hollowed-out shell. I stepped out onto the streets of Charleston, the humid air of the historic district thick with the smell of salt and old secrets. I headed toward the district board, hoping for a shred of the community support my father had cultivated for decades. But as I walked, I noticed the change. Mrs. Gable, who used to bring me lemon bars, crossed the street to avoid me. The local archivist, a man I had consulted with a dozen times, suddenly found a very interesting stack of papers to study when I entered his shop. I soon found out why. Belvine hadn't just served me a notice. She had conducted a character assassination. On the community board and every social media group in the district, she had posted a tearful, carefully crafted message. She portrayed herself as a heartbroken mother forced to evict an unstable daughter who had suffered a mental break and was systematically destroying the historic integrity of the family home. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching, I whispered to myself, looking at the screen of a neighbor's phone. But it's hard when everyone is watching and seeing a lie. The weight of being erased was a physical pressure in my chest. Everywhere I turned, my lifelines were cut. My professional reputation, my social standing, my history in this city. All of it was being dismantled as efficiently as my bookshelves. This wasn't just an eviction, it was a systematic attempt to destroy my entire existence. It's a terrifying thing to realize that the people who share your blood are the same ones who know exactly where to twist the knife. Exhausted and feeling the cold sting of total isolation, I sat on a weathered park bench near the Battery. The harbor was a slate gray, the waves churning with a coming storm. I sat there for a long time, just watching the water. Then a small, wrinkled hand placed a paper cup of hot tea on the bench beside me. It was an old neighbor, a woman who had worked with my father years ago. She didn't say a word. She didn't even look at me. She just gave my shoulder a quick, firm squeeze and walked away. A tiny anchor of hope. I held the cup, the warmth seeping into my chilled fingers. Small acts of kindness are the only things that survive the storm. I took a sip of the tea and felt a shift in my gut. I was done defending my past. It was time to focus on the future. I pulled a burner phone from my bag, one Soren had given me months ago for contingencies. I knew Belvine and Cyprian were likely monitoring my primary lines, probably through the security system Cyprian had recently installed. I dialed Soren's private number. "It's Aneurin," I said when he picked up. "The wood is gone, but they haven't found the key. I'm done being the obedient daughter." "Good," Soren replied, his voice a steady anchor. "Because they're getting greedy. We need to move." I reached into my pocket and felt the cool metal of my father's safe deposit box key. They were so busy tearing down the walls that they hadn't realized the real legacy wasn't in the bricks. It was in the paper. I decided then that I would no longer be a ghost in my own house. I would be the owner of my own destiny. As I walked back toward the house, I saw Xylia on the porch, her phone held high as she laughed with a group of men in expensive suits. Investors, no doubt. She was filming the progress of the renovation. I didn't flinch. I walked past the rubble of my life on the driveway, my head held high. I passed Cyprian at the door. He leaned against the frame, a toothpick in his mouth, looking at me like I was a strayed dog he was finally getting rid of. "I hope you enjoy the view while you still have it, Cyprian," I said softly, not stopping. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Soren. "They just tried to access the trust fund. We have to move tonight." The afternoon sun hung low over the Charleston harbor, casting long, bruised shadows across the kitchen tiles. This was once a room that breathed with the scent of my father's sourdough and cinnamon, a place of warmth and flower-dusted laughter. Now, it reeked of Belvine's artificial floral perfume and the cold, metallic tang of a trap being set. My mother sat at the mahogany table, her back perfectly straight, pouring tea with a hand so steady it felt like a provocation. "Sit down, Aneurin," she said, her voice dripping with a practiced, honeyed grief. "We need to talk about your future. I've been so worried about where you'll go once the 3 days are up." I pulled out a chair, the wood scraping harshly against the floor, a sound that felt like a protest. Have you ever looked at your own mother and realized the woman who gave you life was now trying to dismantle it piece by piece? It is a specific kind of hollow pain. Belvine slid a porcelain cup toward me, then pushed a document across the table. It was titled Relocation Support Agreement. "It's a fund to help you settle into a nice apartment downtown," she explained, her eyes wide and pleading. "I just need your signature to release the family assets." I didn't touch the tea. My eyes scanned the fine print with the surgical precision I used for restoring delicate manuscripts. Beneath the flowery language of familial support lay a jagged edge. It was a total waiver of my father's life insurance policy and a signed confession of financial mismanagement regarding the house repairs. If I signed this, I wouldn't just be homeless. I'd be legally bankrupt and disgraced, handed over to the mercy of a family that had none. "The tea is getting cold, dear," she prompted. I picked up the fountain pen. My hand didn't shake. I thought about my father's voice telling me that trust is a privilege earned, not a right of birth. I looked Belvine directly in the eye, seeing the greed flickering behind her carefully curated mask of maternal concern. I didn't sign my name. In a slow, elegant script, I wrote 2 words across the signature line: "The stranger." "What is this?" she hissed, her mask finally slipping to reveal the jagged resentment underneath. "I am not signing away my future, Mother," I said, standing up. "I am signing away your power over me. Forgiveness is a gift I give myself so I don't rot from the inside, but trust is something you have spent until the account is empty." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the poisoned tea untouched. The silence in the hallway felt heavy, but for the first time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt like armor. The air outside was thick with the humid weight of a South Carolina evening. As I stepped onto the front lawn, the scene was even worse than the kitchen. Xylia was there, her phone mounted on a gimbal, twirling through the grass like a manic pixie. She had organized a flash garage sale on our historic Charleston lawn. My professional wood-turning lathes, my rare architecture books, and my father's antique drafting table were all lined up like common junk. Every single item had a bright $1 USD sticker slapped onto it. "Look at this vintage clutter, guys," Xylia chirped into her camera, her voice a shrill weapon. "We're clearing out the dead weight. Out with the old, in with the gold." I watched as a complete stranger handed her $1 for my father's favorite brass compass, the one he used to teach me about true north. My knuckles whitened, but I didn't scream. I didn't give her the viral footage of a breakdown that she was clearly baiting me for. I walked past her, ignoring the sneers of the bargain hunters. I knelt in the lavender garden my father had planted when I was 10. The purple blooms were swaying in the breeze, unaware that their world was being sold for pennies. I dug my fingers into the rich, dark soil, feeling the grit beneath my nails. I gathered a handful of the dirt, the only part of this legacy they hadn't found a way to monetize, and tucked it deep into my pocket. Xylia skipped over, her phone aimed at my face. "Going to start a farm in your new studio apartment Aneurin? Or are you just playing in the dirt because you've finally lost it?" I looked up at her, my mud-stained hands a stark contrast to her manicured fingers and the glowing screen of her phone. "You are selling the shell of a life, Xylia," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of a gavel. "But you can never possess the soul that built it. True value isn't found in what you can sell to strangers. It's found in what you refuse to lose." She rolled her eyes and turned back to her live stream, but for a second, I saw her hand tremor. I walked back toward the porch, my heart a drum of steady resolve. I realized then that my siblings weren't just greedy. They were hollow. They were trying to fill a void with furniture and followers, while I was carrying the foundation of our history in my pocket. Near the driveway, a junk removal truck was idling. Cyprian was overseeing the men as they threw the last of my packed boxes into the back. These were the things I hadn't moved to Soren's office yet. old sketches, my favorite chisels, the small remnants of a life. I saw one of the men toss a box of my father's old letters, and the cardboard burst open on the pavement. "Careful with that," I said, stepping toward them. Cyprian blocked my path, his chest puffed out with the unearned bravado of a man who thinks he's won. "It's all trash now, sis. You're leaving tomorrow, remember? Mom wants the driveway clear for the new buyer's walkthrough." I looked at the letters scattered on the ground. I realized then that staying any longer wasn't an act of loyalty. It was an act of self-destruction. You have to let a house fall sometimes to see the foundation clearly. I spoke a silent promise to my father's spirit. I will save the legacy, even if I have to burn the bridge to do it. I walked past the chaos of the sale, past the mocking live stream, and past the mother who had tried to sign my life away. I reached the mailbox at the edge of the property. I pulled out a thick, legal envelope addressed to the Phoenix Heritage Trust. Inside were the deeds, the codicil, and the irrevocable transfer of management Soren had prepared. I slid it into the slot and heard the heavy thud as it fell. That was the moment the bridge burned. Turning her back on the chaos of the front lawn, I caught Belvine's gaze through the living room window. She was watching me, a smug, triumphant smile playing on her lips as she watched her youngest daughter retreat down the sidewalk. She thought she had won. She thought she had evicted me from my life. But as I walked away, my phone chimed in my pocket. A notification from Soren. Transfer initiated. Property status. In escrow. I didn't smile back. I just kept walking, my eyes as calm as the eye of a hurricane. The neon glow of the downtown Charleston streetlights cut through the tinted windows of the SUV, casting sharp blue-white streaks across the leather seats. Inside, the air was unnaturally still. A vacuum of silence that stood in brutal contrast to the splintering wood and mocking laughter I had left behind at the Rickman house. Soren sat beside me, his profile etched in the dim light of the dashboard. He didn't speak immediately. He knew I needed the silence to shed the skin of the obedient daughter I had worn for far too long. Soren handed me a fountain pen and a thick stack of high-grade vellum. These were the final documents for the emergency transfer and heritage preservation sale. I looked at the top page, the words Phoenix Heritage Trust, standing out in bold, authoritative type. By signing this, I wasn't just selling a piece of real estate. I was placing my father's life's work into a vault where my family's greed could never touch it again. I signed my name, Aneurin Rickman, with a hand that felt steadier than it had in years. The scratching of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the car, a rhythmic, final cadence that felt like a heartbeat. "Are you absolutely sure, Aneurin?" Soren asked, his voice low, his eyes reflecting the flickering city lights. "Once I file these with the county recorder, the bridge is gone. There is no going back for Belvine, Xylia, or Cyprian. They will be legally severed from this property forever." I looked past him toward the dark expanse of the harbor, where the water churned against the stone battery. "To build something new, you often have to clear the ground first," I said, my voice surprising me with its lack of tremor. "I am not destroying my family, Soren. I am simply stopping them from destroying the last bit of my father's soul. You can't save people who are determined to drown you to keep themselves dry." My invisibility within this family had been my greatest training ground. For 32 years, I had been the child they forgot to notice, the one who moved through the rooms like a ghost, repairing what they broke and cleaning what they soiled. They never suspected that the quiet one was observing every hidden debt, every forged signature, and every whispered scheme. I had spent my life learning their weaknesses while they never bothered to learn my name. Even in this tactical victory, a strange, hollow compassion stirred in my chest. I turned to Soren, my fingers tightening around the legal folder. "I want you to ensure a small, irrevocable stipend is set aside for my mother's medical care in the future. Nothing luxurious, just enough for a decent facility when the time comes." I paused, looking at the city lights. Being treated poorly doesn't give me a license to lose my own humanity. I will provide what is necessary, but I will no longer provide what is comfortable. Soren nodded, his expression softening. He confirmed that the escrow was funded and the immediate vacation notice would be triggered the moment the trust took possession. Under South Carolina property law, Belvine's own self-signed eviction notice from my birthday was the smoking gun. It was perfect evidence of her bad faith and her lack of legal standing. She had built a gallows for me, never realizing she was the one standing on the trapdoor. I reached into my pocket and clutched the handful of lavender-scented soil I had taken from the garden. The grit beneath my nails was a reminder of what was real. I had spent so long trying to belong in a house that didn't want me, forgetting that home isn't where you were born, it's where you are allowed to grow. I felt a bittersweet liberation, a weight lifting that I hadn't realized I was carrying since my father's funeral. The return to the house was the hardest part. I walked through the front door to find Cyprian sitting in the foyer, his feet up on an antique side table I had painstakingly restored. He was drinking my father's most expensive scotch, the amber liquid glowing in the crystal glass. He looked up, his face twisted into a sneer as he spotted my old worn suitcase by the door. "Heading to a shelter, Aneurin?" he asked, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. "Or did you finally find a basement to haunt? You should hurry. Xylia's already picked out the paint for your room. It's a very bright, very loud pink, just like her." I didn't take the bait. I didn't shout or plead. I simply looked at him, seeing the smallness of the man behind the expensive drink. I felt a strange sense of pity. He was so obsessed with the shell of wealth that he had no idea the foundation had already been sold out from under him. I gave him a faint, knowing smile that seemed to flicker for just a second. "I hope you enjoy every drop of that scotch, Cyprian," I said softly, my voice calm enough to make him pause. "Everything in life has a price. Some things are far more expensive than they appear. I hope the taste is worth what it's about to cost you." He laughed, but the sound was forced, lacking its usual bite. I walked past him without another word, heading up the stairs to my doorless room. I set my alarm for 5 a.m., the hour when the tide would finally turn. I looked at my phone and saw a confirmation email from the county records office. The subject line was cold and professional. "Transfer recorded. Public notice pending." Closing my eyes for the last time in the house I once called home, I whispered to the walls, "You're safe now." I knew that by dawn, the locks would belong to someone else entirely, and the family that thought they were throwing me away would finally realize they had already evicted themselves. The Charleston mist clung to the lavender garden at 5 a.m., thick and damp like a shroud. I walked through the house one last time, my footsteps echoing in the foyer that now looked like a pillaged tomb. The oak shelves were gone, leaving jagged scars on the plaster. I felt the weight of my father's watch on my wrist, ticking away the final minutes of a 32-year history. I wasn't leaving as a victim. I was escaping like a captive who had finally found the loose stone in the cell wall. I dragged my single suitcase to the front door, the wheels rattling against the hardwood. Belvine, Xylia, and Cyprian were already gathered near the banister, the air thick with the premature scent of celebration. They were leaning against the railing, clutching glasses of early morning champagne as if they had already won the lottery. They watched me with amused contempt, mocking the fact that I was leaving with so little. They didn't understand that the heaviest things I owned were already safely in Soren's hands. Xylia lifted her gimbal, the lens following my every move. "The walk of shame, everyone," she whispered to her followers. "The little sister finally realizes she's just a guest who overstayed her welcome. Bye-bye, Aneurin. Don't let the door hit you on your way to whatever basement you've rented." I stopped at the threshold, the cool morning air hitting my face. I didn't flinch. I turned to Belvine, who looked at me with a cold, triumphant smile. "A person's worth isn't measured by the ground they stand on, but by the peace they carry in their heart," I said, my voice steady enough to make Cyprian pause his laughter. "I hope you find the peace you're looking for in these empty walls. Sometimes the hardest part of moving forward is realizing that the door you're closing was never meant to be a bridge, but a wall." I stepped out onto the porch, the dawn light beginning to bleed through the gray sky. But as I reached my car, Belvine's voice cut through the air, sharp and desperate. "Stop right there, Aneurin!" She rushed down the steps, her face twisted with a sudden toxic panic. She accused me of stealing a set of family heirlooms, gold jewelry that had belonged to our grandmother. She claimed she had already called the police, hoping to humiliate me and force a public search of my car before I could escape Charleston. I stood by my vehicle, perfectly still. I watched as the patrol car pulled into the driveway, its lights silent but ominous. Belvine pointed a trembling finger at me, playing the role of the victimized matriarch for the officer. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply reached into my bag and produced a dated, notarized inventory of every item I had packed, cross-referenced with photos taken the night before. I handed the folder to the officer. "Integrity is its own defense," I said, looking directly at the officer. "My mother is grieving a version of me that never existed. Please, check the car. I have nothing to hide because I took nothing that wasn't mine." The search was brief and yielded nothing but my own clothes and restoration manuals. The officer tipped his cap to me and turned to Belvine, advising her against filing false reports. After the patrol car left, I looked at my mother with genuine pity. "You've spent your life building cages for others, Mother. I truly hope you don't realize you're the only one left inside them until it's too late." I got into my car and drove to the end of the street, pulling over into a shaded spot. I waited. It was 9 a.m. In my rearview mirror, I could see the Rickman porch. Belvine and my siblings were back at the banister, their champagne glasses refilled. They were waiting for the investor they had Len Lutt contacted to finalize their illegal sale of my property. They looked like royalty presiding over a kingdom that was already turning to sand. Then the first black SUV turned onto Willow Street. Then another. A truck from Phoenix Heritage pulled into the driveway, followed by Soren's sedan. I saw Belvine rush down the steps, her face lit with a greedy, triumphant smile. She expected a check. She expected a coronation. Instead, a grim-faced representative stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 private security guards. Belvine tried to welcome them as the sellers, her hand outstretched. The representative didn't even look at her hand. He checked his clipboard, his expression as cold as the legal documents he carried. "We are here to secure the property," he said, his voice carrying clearly to where I sat. "Our client, Aneurin Rickman, has already finalized the transfer of this estate to the trust." "Who are you people?" Belvine's face turned ashen, the champagne glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the stone driveway. She looked toward the street, her eyes finding my car idling in the distance. Soren stepped forward, pulling a legal folder from his briefcase. "Mrs. Rickman," he said with a voice of absolute authority, "you are currently trespassing on property owned by a preservation trust. You and your children have exactly 30 minutes to vacate these premises." The silence that followed the hammer's strike against the no trespassing sign was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I sat in my car at the edge of the driveway, the engine idling with a low hum that felt like a purr of liberation. In the rearview mirror, the Rickman estate stood as a silent witness to a decade of labor and a lifetime of betrayal. But as I pulled away, the scene unfolding on the porch behind me drew me back into the vortex of the moment. I didn't want to watch, yet the gravity of justice demanded a witness. Belvine stood frozen on the top step, her hand still clutching a half-empty champagne glass. Her face, usually a mask of aristocratic poise, had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of terror. Soren stood before her, his posture as unyielding as the South Carolina oaks. He wasn't yelling, he was simply presenting a leather-bound folder containing the recorded survivorship deed and the immediate vacation order issued by the Phoenix Heritage Trust. The greedy smile Belvine had held for the investors just minutes ago had vanished, replaced by the pale, sickly hue of a woman realizing she was standing on air. Soren's voice carried through the humid morning air, sharp and clinical. He began explaining the ironclad reality of the state's property laws. Because I had inherited the house 5 years ago through a survivorship deed my father had recorded in secret, Belvine never held the legal title. She never had the authority to issue an eviction notice to anyone, let alone the rightful owner. By serving me that paper on my birthday, she hadn't just insulted me. She had inadvertently alerted the state to her own lack of legal standing. She had invited the law into a house built on a foundation of lies. And now the house was pushing her out. Cyprian, ever the brute, tried to physically block the security team from entering the foyer. He bellowed about squatters' rights and family loyalty, his face flushed with the rage of a man losing a prize he never earned. But the officers didn't hesitate. They produced a court-ordered injunction, their movements professional and indifferent to his tantrum. Xylia's phone was still in her hand, her arm trembling as she realized her live stream was no longer a celebration of her sister's defeat, but a digital broadcast of her own family's ruin. The irony was a bitter pill that she was forced to swallow in front of thousands of strangers. I stepped out of my car and walked slowly toward the porch. The eviction notice for my birthday lay crumpled on the floorboards, a discarded scrap of silver paper with a red bow that was now being stepped on by the heavy boots of the trust's representatives. It was a cinematic moment of total reversal. Justice, I thought, is not about making someone suffer. It is about restoring the balance that greed has tipped. Belvine saw me approaching and collapsed to her knees, her silk dress spreading across the dusty porch. "Aneurin!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "How could you be so cruel? I am your mother. You are leaving your own flesh and blood on the sidewalk. Think of the scandal. Think of our name." I stopped at the bottom step and looked up at her. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to shrink or apologize. I pulled the original birthday notice from my pocket, the one she had given me with such cruel intent. "Mother, you taught me that staying too long in a place where you aren't wanted is a mistake," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I am simply helping you follow your own advice. You didn't just want me out of this house. You wanted me out of your life. I am merely granting your wish." Despite the systematic way she had tried to erase me, a final quiet ember of humanity glowed in my chest. I didn't want her blood on my hands, even if she had spent years trying to spill mine. I reached into my bag and handed Soren a check and a set of keys to a modest, fully furnished rental apartment 3 blocks away. I had paid the rent for a year in advance. "I will not watch you sleep on the street," I told her, my eyes never wavering. "But I will no longer allow you to sleep in my father's house. Character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you. I am choosing to be better than the lesson you taught me. This is your mercy, Mother. Take it, because it is the last thing I will ever give you." The neighbors who had turned their backs on me just days ago were now peeking through their curtains or standing on their own porches in stunned silence. The truth was an undeniable flood, washing away the toxic narrative Belvine had spent years weaving. I watched as the security team began moving their belongings, mostly the items they had tried to steal from my workshop or sell at the garage sale, to the sidewalk. It was a messy, public ending to a private war. I walked into the house one last time, my footsteps echoing in the foyer. The rooms were empty of their furniture, but full of the memories I had tried so hard to protect. I saw the jagged gashes in the wall where Cyprian had taken the chainsaw to the bookshelves. "The wood can be replaced," I whispered to the empty air. "The truth cannot." In that moment, I realized I had finally evicted the toxic influence of my family from the sanctuary of my own soul. I was no longer the invisible child. I was the guardian of the legacy. Soren met me by the front door, his expression grave. He revealed the final blow. Because they had destroyed historic parts of a protected property, the Heritage Trust was filing a civil suit for damages against Cyprian and Belvine. The very greed they had used to try and bankrupt me was now the chain that would bind them to their own financial ruin. They had gambled with a house they didn't own, and the house had finally called their bluff. As the last of their designer bags and stolen trinkets were tossed onto the curb, I walked back to my car. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph of my father. He was standing in front of the house when the garden was first planted, a look of quiet peace on his face. "It's over, Dad," I whispered. "The house is finally at peace, and so am I." I got into the driver's seat and shifted into gear. I didn't look back at the 3 figures huddled among their luggage on the sidewalk. I didn't need to see their tears or hear their excuses. I looked forward at the open road, the Charleston sun finally feeling warm against my skin. I had taken back everything that belonged to me, including the right to my own silence. 6 months had passed since the morning the world tilted back onto its axis. I stood in the foyer of the Rickman estate, but the air no longer carried the sharp, biting scent of artificial floral perfume and mounting deception. Instead, the house breathed with the deep, grounding aroma of old paper, warm beeswax, and the lavender garden that had now doubled in size, its purple blooms reclaiming the yard. Above the heavy oak doors, a bronze sign gleamed in the Charleston sun, the Rickman Heritage Library. What was once a battlefield of greed had been transformed into a sanctuary of truth, a public legacy born from a private war. I walked through the halls, not as the invisible child, but as the lead consultant for the Phoenix Heritage Trust. Every step felt intentional. In the center of the foyer stood my father's drafting table, the one Cyprian had tried to sell for $1. It was meticulously restored, its scarred surface a map of our shared history. It served as a reminder that what others saw as junk was actually the foundation of something eternal. Soren met me near the arched windows, a slim leather portfolio in his hand. He looked younger, the heavy burden of my father's secret finally lifted from his shoulders. He handed me the final audit of the civil suit. Belvine, Xylia, and Cyprian's attempts to countersue had been a spectacular failure. Their own digital footprints, the very live streams they used to mock my eviction, had become the primary evidence against them. They were forced to pay for every splinter of historic wood they destroyed. The law of gravity had finally caught up with them. I paused before my father's portrait, my fingers tracing the silver frame. I realized that the truth doesn't just set you free. It builds a roof over your head that no storm can blow away. By refusing to play the victim, I hadn't just saved a house. I had become the architect of my family's only remaining shred of honor. I had forced them to be accountable, which was the greatest act of love I had left to give them. A week ago, I received a letter from the modest apartment complex where Belvine now resides. The tone was hollow, stripped of its usual venom. Xylia's digital empire had collapsed under the weight of the scandal, and Cyprian was now working a manual labor job at the docks to pay off his court-ordered debts. They were struggling with a reality that had no mirrors and no champagne. I decided to visit them one last time, not to gloat, but to deliver a final box of my father's personal letters I had rescued from the curb. I didn't enter the apartment. I met them in the small communal garden out front, a space that felt cramped compared to the porches of Willow Street. I maintained a firm, quiet boundary as I handed over the box. Belvine looked at me, her eyes searching for a weakness, a sign that I would invite them back. "Aneurin," she whispered, her voice fragile. "When the library is settled, will you ever move back home? Will we?" I looked at the woman who had tried to erase me and felt a profound, weary compassion. "I didn't save that house to live in the past, Mother," I said, my voice steady. "I saved it so the past could stop haunting me. I have given you a roof and a bed. What you build inside those four walls is now entirely up to you. My loyalty to this family has ended where my respect for myself began. I realized then that blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect make you family. I chose to forgive them for my own peace, but I was choosing to stay away for my own soul. It wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of survival. I had learned that you cannot fix people who are determined to break you. You can only move out of the way." I walked back to my car, my hands feeling clean and strong. I was no longer defined by the Rickman name, the youngest daughter label, or the betrayal that had nearly broken me. I was a woman who owned her own name and her own future. I looked at the bronze plaque on the library one last time. Resilience isn't just about surviving the storm, it's about learning how to use the wind to find a different shore. Sometimes you have to lose your place in the world to find your place in yourself. My father's greatest gift wasn't the bricks and mortar of the estate. It was the quiet, unyielding strength he instilled in me to protect what is right, even when I was standing alone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the handful of lavender soil I had carried since the day of the eviction. I scattered it over the new garden beds, the dark earth disappearing into the landscape. The grief was finally gone, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. As I drove away from Charleston, the sunset reflected in my rearview mirror, a blaze of orange and gold that felt like a benediction. I was free. My heart was silent. For the first time in 32 years, I wasn't looking back to see if anyone was following me. I was simply driving toward the horizon, where the road was wide and the sky was endless.